Hello, and welcome to the Washington Monthly. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
In this episode, the geography of opportunity.
Is so unevenly distributed across the country, and it varies on all sorts of scales. It varies broadly regionally between the Northeast corridor or the West Coast and the Deep South or Appalachia. It varies within states, within counties, and then really neighborhood by neighborhood.
My guest is Kenan Fikri, Senior Fellow at the Economic Innovation Group, a bipartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C. Kenan is the architect of the Distressed Communities Index, a comprehensive analysis of who is prospering in America and where. Hey, Kenan, it is great to see you. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ann.
So, Kenan, for almost the past decade, you have been a mastermind of this really remarkable data set, the Distressed Communities Index. And here's a headline number from this year's report that 51 million Americans live in a, quote, stressed community. I mean, that's 15% of the U.S. population. So can you define first what it means to be a distressed community?
Yeah, absolutely. So we define distress in the DCI based on 7 different complementary social and economic metrics. So we look at the poverty rate, we look at income levels, we look at housing vacancy rates, educational attainment, and job growth, and the opening or closing of new business establishments, so business growth too. So we put all that together to provide a summary statistic of economic well-being at the zip code level all across the United States. And then communities that rank in the bottom 1/5 of all zip codes nationally, we consider distressed, bottom quintile of zip codes across those kind of 7 metrics equally weighted. I will say though that even though it's a relative measure of distress, the 20% of all zip codes will always be distressed on our definition. The gaps that it captures are really absolute. And by that, I mean poverty rates in distressed communities are more than twice as high as they are nationwide. It means that, in a period of strong national economic growth, distressed communities are generally going to be losing jobs and suffering from net business closures. The condition of being economically distressed at the local level in the United States today is really one of, I think, being disconnected from the broader national story, or at least the national growth story.
Got it. Got it. One of the remarkable things about your work is how it shows just how unevenly opportunity is distributed in America. You have maps online that show where the distressed communities are, but also maps that show where the communities that are prospering are located. So can you talk a little bit about the geographic distribution of distressed communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, though, economic opportunity is so unevenly distributed across the country, and it varies on all sorts of scales. It varies broadly regionally between, the Northeast corridor or the West Coast and the Deep South or Appalachia. It varies within states, within counties, and then really neighborhood by neighborhood. And that's why we start at the zip code level to really see kind of at the scale at which most Americans live, work, go to school, consume, how does well-being kind of vary in those geographic units from one to the next. And you do see the so-called other side of the tracks phenomenon, where on really small geographic scales you have wide divergences in economic well-being. Often these may follow municipal boundaries, right? We can look at cities in the Midwest, and often sometimes all the zip codes that are part of the city will be economically distressed, but as soon as you leave that core municipality and enter more suburban jurisdictions, you're then at a totally different plane of national economic well-being. But that's at the very local level. I'd say if you're looking at the US map, kind of looking state by state, we see a concentration of distressed zip codes in the Deep South, first and foremost, in states such as Louisiana and Mississippi, but then kind of stretching all the way up across the so-called Eastern Heartland into Ohio and Michigan, where you're still seeing, above national percents of state populations living in distressed communities. But really, these pockets exist in really almost every major metropolitan area is going to have a good chunk of distressed zip codes at its center, and then across numerous rural areas as well, you'll see pockets of distress. So it is a national phenomenon. It's concentrated in particular corners, but distress is a condition that affects Americans in almost every corner of the country.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about the disparity in the poverty rate between the bottom quintile and the top quintile, but can you give us a little bit more of a sense of how stark these disparities are by, you know, income level, for instance, or other measures of well-being that are in the DCI?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I like to myself zoom in on particular, typically Sunbelt metropolitan areas or counties, like very populous counties such as Harris County, Texas, or Maricopa County, Arizona, where you can see that. Take Harris County, for example. I believe it's 1.4 million residents of that county. It's one of the most populous in the country, but 1.4 million residents live in a distressed zip code. In the same county, you have 1.1 million residents living in a prosperous zip code. And here we're talking about poverty rates that may be, 30% or higher in the distressed portion of the community to below 5% in some more outlying jurisdiction. You're going to see huge gaps in educational attainment too, and even in something like vacancy rates, where you have a lot of disinvested properties. You may have, 1 in 6, 1 in 7, 1 in 5 homes vacant in a distressed corner, even of a growth markets such as Houston, whereas you're going to have really low vacancy rates because there's such demand to live in a place and kind of a constant stream of reinvestment in more well-off areas.
hmm I want to talk now about who exactly lives in these distressed communities, their demographics, you know, and distressed communities versus the characteristics of people living in more prosperous places. And, one of the things that was really intriguing to me was the extent to which you found that in distressed communities, men are earning a lot less than women. And of course, there's stark racial inequality as well. So if you could talk a little bit about the demographics.
Yeah, absolutely. And place is really a vector and a frame to talk about people. It's zip codes and communities. I'm a geographer, right? Zip codes and counties are, interesting units for a geographer because they do kind of summarize and offer a summary of the people living in those jurisdictions. And if it's an organizing unit for social analysis as well as economic analysis. And, starting first with demography and race and ethnicity, before turning to gender, we see that generally in the United States, minorities are overrepresented in distressed communities and underrepresented in prosperous communities. That differs a little bit by, subtype of race and ethnicity. Asian Americans are relatively more represented, better represented in prosperous communities. Hispanic Americans are generally clustered in the middle to lower tiers of communities on the DCI, and African Americans and Native Americans are disproportionately concentrated in the distressed tier themselves. I believe African Americans are about twice the share of the population in distressed communities as they are nationally, and Americans pushing 4 times as represented in the distressed tier. So that, yeah, we're talking about, place as a way to kind of understand or reveal really long running social kind of conditions and afflictions in the United States today. And I think that you can't, when you're looking at something like the DCI, separate people from place from history. It is all living history today in the economic conditions people experience.
Yeah. And on the gender piece about the disparity in like men's earning power versus women in some of these communities is really striking, especially when we have so many discussions politically about men and masculinity and stolen pride, to borrow the title of Raleigh Russell Hochschild's book.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was the first year that we actually looked at gender through the lens of the DCI. I think we assumed, I guess naively, could say stupidly to be self-critical, but that there wouldn't necessarily be that much variation across gender in the DCI and in the framework that we're looking at. But we were really surprised to find, yes, that the earnings gap is wider in distressed communities, and that in general, men's economic conditions deteriorate much faster than women's do as you kind of go down the spectrum of community distress. Male educational attainment really lags behind, and kind of it's a sharp decline in college attainment rates as you move from the prosperous to the comfortable to mid-tier, at risk, and then distressed quintiles. And women's educational attainment is much more stable regardless of community. It's still, there are fewer women with college degrees in distressed communities than in prosperous ones, but it's a much smoother gradient than it is for men. So I think It's really an understudied corner of social science right now, kind of the connection and even the vulnerability that men face with limited economic conditions, and then how that makes stabilizing a community harder as it filters through to family structures and things like that. So
Yeah.
I think it underscores the fact that this is a corner of discourse and understanding that we need to turn to as a country, because whatever currents are underway in societies today are running really deep, and they also run through space and communities.
Yeah, yeah, that was a really remarkable finding. Does your research show any indication of why these gaps are happening? I'm assuming that in parts of the Rust Belt where we found distress, it's a story about manufacturing, the loss of manufacturing there as the assumption, but did you pick up any clues as to what was going on?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish we picked up greater clues. I think it does come down to economic opportunity in particular sectors. Men are likelier to find employment in traded sectors, be that manufacturing or potentially white collar work, than the traditionally non-traded or less traded sectors such as education, healthcare, social assistance, and some other professional services jobs that really don't vary as much by location that women tend to be overrepresented in. So I think that it does run through either the elimination or loss of those traded sector jobs in
Mhm.
such as manufacturing, or in some cases, like in rural areas, maybe the fact that there never were that many strong jobs or like good jobs in those sectors to begin with, and that carries through to limited opportunity today. So I think we have a mix of kind of a loss of opportunity and a long history of just missing opportunity in
Yeah,
different locations.
yeah. And just to clarify, by traded sector, you mean a sector that's susceptible to outsourcing?
Mean, yeah, it's economic geographer speak. Traded sector is something where that you kind of sell beyond the region. You could
Gotcha.
envision, yeah, yeah. So manufacturing would be traded. You could envision like consulting services as a traded sector activity too. So kind of information internet services too. Really, anything that you're selling to a wider market, be it nationally or globally, than kind of just the local community where people's incomes just kind of circulate among things like doctors and grocery stores.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Your customer base, your client base is, like, right there in the same community
Yeah,
where you're
yeah,
in, whereas if you're a consultant, you're actually competing with consultants around the country or around the world, so
yes,
it might be
yes.
tougher for you. Got it. Okay. Let's talk about education because that's something that you alluded to earlier, and this was another stunning statistic in your report, that the 53% of people living in distressed communities had finished high school at most. It's really, really surprising. What is the connection then between levels of education and levels of distress? I mean, do low levels of education cause a community to become distressed, or is it the other way around? Like, which way does the causal connection run?
Yeah, I mean, it is really difficult to find a good job today without a more than a high school education. I think a lot of people who have found a good job with limited education may now be nearing the end of their careers, right? So they may have been in industries and entered industries when credentials didn't matter as much as they do today. So we do see the education kind of well-being gradient to or the relationship between education and well-being to be extremely strong, and it's one of the first things that I would point to explain the geography of well-being today. It's going to be the geography of where college educated Americans live, will be the well-off geography where Americans with kind of high school or less live, predominantly distressed geography, and then the more mixed communities where you have folks with associate's degrees or some college, interspersed with folks from both the high and low ends of the educational attainment spectrum living together. You'll get more kind of mid-tier communities. So, I think education, I don't want to run to the conclusion that more education for everyone is automatically better, because there are a lot of problems with higher educational system today, and quality and affordability concerns. But the fact, remains that that college degree is still the ticket to opportunity in the United States today. And I think we see that feed through to the DCI.
But the problem is, of course, that a lot of times when someone in a rural community, for instance, gets a college degree, they don't necessarily stay in the community,
Sure.
right? Which means that they take their opportunity with them or they chase the opportunity that exists elsewhere. So yes, it's certainly a very multifaceted
Yeah.
problem. The other
I was just affirming your point that folks who um, are most likely to leave a community are the ones who are kind of most likely to go on and get higher education, then find opportunity elsewhere. That, mobility is lowest for the people who almost most need to get out to find new opportunity, but they're often the ones who are most reluctant to move.
I've also appreciated how the DCI defines well-being to go beyond simply financial security. And one of the things that you found is that living in a distressed community has real costs for individuals beyond simply the material. You find that on average, people living in distressed communities can actually expect to die 5 years sooner than the counterparts in prosperous areas, which was yet another stunning and depressing
Yes.
finding from this research. What accounts for that difference, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question, and even that 5 year statistic is summarizing across all counties is where we do the life expectancy analysis rather than zip codes, but summarizing across all counties in the top and bottom quintiles. But even if you look to zoom in on Virginia, close to us, it's almost a 20-year gap in life expectancy between
Wow.
Arlington, Virginia, and Petersboro, a city predominantly African American in Southern Virginia. Absolutely shocking statistics that one show why place matters to understand life outcomes today, because and the DCI has really found a niche in a lot of healthcare research as like a stand-in for the social determinants of health in studies that healthcare researchers and medical researchers are engaged in, because place kind of corrals a whole bunch of unobservable factors into one unit. So what do I mean by that? I mean that there are things like social connections, like access to quality foods, access to not just quality healthcare, but access to people and social groups and amenities and all sorts of kind of wraparound services and culture that support
Mhm.
good health that might be missing in a community. And it, I think, also speaks to the toll, psychological and physical, that living in such an unequal country where inequalities are experienced so viscerally and so starkly on such small scales, that the toll that takes on individual lives and livelihoods. And I think that's really what it comes down to at the end. The DCI and I think distressed communities are places, again, that are disconnected from the broader kind of national economic whole, the broader national experience, which is still generally positive. But when you kind of fall through the pretty porous floor that the US economy puts underneath people and places, things can start to get pretty grim.
Yeah. I have to ask a little bit more of a fraught question now, but when you look at the map of distressed communities versus prosperous ones, there is a huge similarity to the maps that show you red versus blue. The deep south, as you mentioned, is more distressed and it's more red, and the coasts are a little bit more blue and they tend to be a little bit more prosperous. What can you say about distress and prosperity and the state of political polarization that we're all experiencing?
Yes, I wish I had the key to solve that and dispel all the political polarization for us. Alas, I don't. But one thing that I don't want to say this with a positive connotation, but I do just one thing an insight that I appreciated and kind of helped my understanding and helped my kind of navigating of the polarization today, is that actually if you look at the population in distressed communities, it's about evenly divided between rural and urban. Rural and urban distress. So distress is one one thing that unites some different American factions geographically, and unfortunately, right? And of course, when you look at the national map, the larger physical units of rural zip codes, make those pop more than the smaller physical units of urban zip codes, right? So necessarily see at the national level, but zoom in, and it is an experience and a problem that affects both parties, both coalitions, and the optimist in me would hope that there may be common ground in people, all of our elected representatives, coming from places and generally caring about the places they call home. We can disagree about a lot else, but I think if we can agree about that, then we can start to talk about, concrete problems that we all agree on, that the economy is failing, particular Americans, uh, extremely, and start
Yeah.
to see where there may be common ground for solutions. That sounds a little naively Pollyanna-ish, perhaps, but I think I think if we have to start somewhere, that's a pretty decent place to start. But then, yeah, I'll finish by saying, like, there is the more broadly, I think if you look at the states of the Midwest, especially, that might not be outright distressed yet, but they've
Hmm.
really fallen out of the prosperous tier, maybe into more middling conditions, that also gets to some of the feelings of being left behind or just not really participating in the best the US economy has to offer. And I think that may help explain why some of the coalitions are fracturing so much.
Mm.
Yeah, that again, places and communities might not have fallen into outright distress and expressed that through kind of embracing populist politics, say, but they do feel their relative standard of living declining. The DCI captures that relative fall, and that yeah, maybe at play. And interestingly, we're seeing now a lot of corners of the Northeast, states like New York, Rhode Island, really start to fall relative to when we first did the DCI in 2010, where kind of the superstar cities and the really college educated places, especially in the Northeast and coasts, were doing best. They had, large swaths of their population in prosperous zip codes. And now, that's been ebbing, especially in certain corners of the Northeast and New York, especially over the past several years, such that now New York and Alabama have equivalent shares of their populations living in
Wow.
prosperous zip codes. So there is, I think our politics always changing. I don't think New York as a state is going to go necessarily
Right.
red populist as it exists today. It is an interesting kind of, the DCI has an interesting lens to understand these relative flows and then, conjecture and discuss how it plays into politics.
Wow, that is fascinating. Well, that definitely leads to my final question for you, which is how do we fix these extremes in regional inequality? I mean, we're never going to eliminate distress altogether. Just let's
Hmm.
posit that. But
Yeah.
how do we ensure that there's better shared prosperity? You talked about common ground. Are there places where you think that common ground can be achieved? And are there specific ideas that you have about what we can do to bring some communities up and also to stop the slide of other communities that are facing distress?
Yeah, yeah, that's the big question, the important question, and I wish I had a better answer. But to me, I am a firm believer in the power of the American economy as in the U.S. economy as the history's greatest engine of wealth and prosperity and opportunity for even the vast majority of people. So I think part of the solution has to run through what I kind of like to call a reconnection agenda, but like recognizing that folks need to have connections, be it physical, be it social, be it economic, to the broader national economy in order to participate in it and seize opportunity in it. So that means making sure that financial markets better serve low income Americans and low income communities. We have some tools in that toolkit from like the CRA, but that's ripe for reform. I do think that opportunity zones is a good step in the right direction to kind of nudge financial markets to return and look at places that have systematically been deprived of capital by private markets left on their own. And I think there's a lot more that can be done beyond that, just to kind of advance that sort of inclusion. I think, yeah, social inclusion. What do I mean by that? Yeah, I think we have to recognize how much opportunity is transmitted or not through the K-12 school system. I think,
Yeah.
those municipal boundaries and geography relationships that I mentioned earlier, I think have a lot to do about school districts and then where, people tend to move and through that isolate different groups. So that's an area, to look at and an area for innovation and reform, I believe. And then, physical connectivity too. We have to be careful here because, say, in the urban renewal era of the mid 1900s, physical connectivity done wrong actually disconnected and severed places. So we're fixing that now, but if you think of rural areas, rural Appalachia, southern West Virginia, these are extremely isolated locales, and it's very hard to even cite labor intensive manufacturing in a place like that,
Yeah.
where it's difficult to get to market. And then the internet age allows us to think of connectivity in a digital sense too, and how that may open up opportunity for people to access jobs outside their region, or even for others to move in, and for there to be some more mixing in American communities, and a kind of bringing of helping refoster mobility in the United States, because I think that was a real engine of opportunity too. I'll stop there.
Well, I hope some of this agenda comes to pass in coming years. Looks like we really need it. So, Kenan, thank you so much for sharing your research.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. Yeah,
Take
thank you.
care. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.